Right now, in the pre-dawn darkness over the Strait of Hormuz, a supertanker called the Sunyan is making its way through 21 miles of water that carry roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply. The deck lights cut through the haze. Below them, 100,000 metric tons of crude sits in pressurized holds, bound for refineries in South Korea and Japan. The captain is on the bridge, the crew is quiet, and somewhere in the military command infrastructure of at least two nations, someone is watching that ship on a radar screen right now. On the trading floor in London, Brent crude has just opened at $93 per barrel, up 11% in 6 days. That is not a price movement driven by supply and demand fundamentals. Analysts who have spent 30 years in energy markets are calling this something different, not a spike, a recalibration. And if they are right, the number you saw at the gas pump this morning is not the ceiling, it is a waypoint. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you. The price of oil right now is not responding to a single event. It is responding to the simultaneous breakdown of three separate stabilizing mechanisms that have held global energy markets together since 2016, and the markets know it, even if the headlines have not caught up yet. This is not a story about oil prices. This is a story about what happens when the architecture that keeps the world's most critical commodity flowing begins to fracture all at once. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why oil markets are pricing in risk that goes far beyond a single military incident, which specific choke points and military capabilities have changed the calculus of global energy security in the last 90 days, and what the direct transmission line looks like from a missile fired over the Persian Gulf to the price of groceries, airline tickets, and heating fuel in your city. Stay with me. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to January 3rd, 2020. That is the night a United States MQ-9 Reaper drone fired a Hellfire missile at a convoy near Baghdad International Airport and killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force. In the weeks that followed, Iran launched ballistic missiles at 2 American bases in Iraq and sent a clear message to every government in the Middle East. The era of calibrated, contained response was over. Tehran had decided it was willing to escalate in ways it had not been before. Markets absorbed that moment and moved on. That was a mistake, because what followed over the next 4 years was not de-escalation, it was accumulation. Iran methodically expanded its network of proxy forces, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, the Islamic resistance factions in Syria. Each group was supplied with increasingly sophisticated weapons. Each group was given a specific role in a distributed deterrent strategy that Tehran calls the axis of resistance. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. If Iran is ever struck directly, the response does not come from Tehran. It comes from multiple directions simultaneously, at targets that are difficult to defend and critical to defend. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched its assault from Gaza into Israel, killing approximately 1,200 people and taking roughly 250 hostages. Within hours, the Houthis in Yemen, operating from territory they had controlled since 2015, announced they would begin targeting Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea in solidarity with Gaza. Most analysts initially dismissed this as rhetoric. It was not. By November 2023, Houthi forces had launched their first anti-ship missile at a vessel transiting the Red Sea. By January 2024, they had struck more than 40 commercial ships and forced a near-total rerouting of container traffic away from the Suez Canal. Let me put this in concrete terms. The Suez Canal route, which connects Asia to Europe through the Red Sea, carries approximately 12% of global trade by volume. When shipping companies began rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, they added between 10 and 14 days of transit time per voyage. That is not a minor inconvenience. That is a structural cost increase across every category of manufactured goods that moves between Asia and Europe: electronics, pharmaceuticals, automotive parts, consumer products. Shipping rates on the Asia to Europe route rose from approximately $1,200 per 40-foot container in October 2023 to over $9,000 by January 2024. Now here is the critical context. All of that, the Red Sea disruption, the rerouting, the insurance premium spikes, happened before the escalation between Israel and Iran went direct. On April 1, 2024, an Israeli airstrike destroyed the Iranian consular annex in Damascus, killing 7 members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, including 2 senior commanders. Iran had publicly warned that a strike on its diplomatic facilities would be treated as a strike on Iranian soil. On the night of April 13, 2024, Iran launched what it called Operation True Promise. Approximately 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles fired directly at Israel from Iranian territory. It was the first direct Iranian military strike on Israel in history. That threshold had now been crossed. and oil markets, which had been watching the slow accumulation of risk for months, finally began to price what analysts had been warning about for years. Then, in the summer and early autumn of 2024, a second front of escalation opened, not in the Persian Gulf, but in the corridors of OPEC plus negotiations in Vienna. Saudi Arabia, which had been holding back approximately 3 million barrels per day of production capacity in coordination with Russia and the rest of the OPEC Plus alliance, signaled it was reconsidering the terms of that agreement. The Saudis needed higher prices to fund Vision 2030, their domestic transformation program. Russia needed higher prices to finance a war in Ukraine that was costing more than it had anticipated. And the United States, which had been pressuring Riyadh to produce more to keep prices down ahead of the November 2024 election, was running out of diplomatic leverage. The production restraint agreement that had kept a ceiling on supply disruption anxiety was showing its first real cracks at exactly the moment that security anxiety over the Strait of Hormuz was reaching a new peak. That combination is what you are seeing priced into oil markets right now. Let us now examine what has actually changed in the military dimension, because this is where most of the financial coverage stops short and where the real risk premium in oil prices is being generated. When Iran launched Operation True Promise in April 2024, the world watched Israel, the United States, France, Jordan, and several Gulf states intercept approximately 99% of the incoming projectiles. The headlines declared a successful defense and a de-escalatory outcome. What the headlines missed was the operational intelligence that military analysts extracted from that event. Iran had deliberately chosen a mix of weapons that forced Israel's defense systems to expend interceptor missiles at a ratio that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Arrow 3 interceptors, which are designed to engage ballistic missiles in the exo-atmosphere, cost approximately $2 to $3 million each. Houthi Shahed 136 loitering munitions cost approximately $20,000 each. When you force a defender to engage cheap drones with expensive interceptors, you are not trying to win the first exchange. You are trying to exhaust the magazine over time. Here is something that no military strategist had seen before in modern history. A non-state proxy in Yemen demonstrating the capability to disrupt global commercial shipping not for a week or a month, but for the better part of a year, using a combination of anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and naval drones, all supplied by Iran. The Houthis have now demonstrated the use of the Tankil anti-ship ballistic missile, which has a range of approximately 2,000 kilometers and carries a warhead capable of penetrating the hull of a supertanker. The distance from Houthi-controlled territory in western Yemen to the southern exit of the Red Sea at Bab el-Mandeb is approximately 150 kilometers. The distance to the Strait of Hormuz, through the Gulf of Aden and around the Arabian Peninsula, is significantly longer, but the Houthis have already demonstrated they are willing to attempt it. And here's the thing the headlines aren't telling you. The U.S. Navy's Operation Prosperity Guardian, the multinational naval coalition assembled to protect Red Sea shipping, has been conducting combat operations continuously since December 2023. USS Dwight D. Eisenhower and its Carrier Strike Group conducted more sustained combat sorties over more consecutive days than any American naval deployment since the Second World War. The flight decks ran around the clock. The magazine depth of SM-2 and SM-6 interceptor missiles, which cost between $2 and $4 million per round, was being drawn down at a rate that the Navy's logistics infrastructure had not anticipated for a conflict of this type. Replenishment vessels scrambled to resupply. Defense contractors were called to accelerate production schedules. This is not abstract. The United States military was, for the first time in decades, conducting sustained high-tempo defensive combat operations against a non-state actor with access to precision-guided munitions. And the inventory math was tighter than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Now layer on the direct Iran-Israel dimension. In October 2024, Israel launched what it described as a targeted strike on Iranian air defense systems and military infrastructure. Specifically, it struck radar systems associated with the S-300 air defense batteries protecting strategic sites in Iran. Iran's S-300 installations, which are Russian-supplied and calibrated to protect nuclear and military sites, were the most sensitive defensive assets in the Iranian military inventory. By striking them, Israel sent a message that it could reach those sites. Iran heard that message clearly. What followed was a period of calibrated silence that analysts read not as de-escalation, but as preparation. Iran began accelerating the dispersal of its uranium enrichment activities at Fordow, Natanz, and a network of hardened underground facilities, putting its most sensitive assets deeper underground and further from Israeli strike range. The Sejil-2 ballistic missile, Iran's most capable solid-fuel ballistic missile, with a range of 2,000 kilometers and a circular error probable measured in meters, was being positioned at mobile launchers that are harder to track and harder to destroy in a preemptive strike. What military strategists are actually saying in the journals and briefing rooms rather than the television studios is this: the window in which Israel could execute a militarily decisive strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure without triggering a sustained multi-front missile campaign against Israeli population centers and Gulf energy infrastructure is closing. The dispersal of enrichment assets, the depth of underground facilities, the improvements in ballistic missile accuracy, and the demonstrated willingness of the Houthi proxy to sustain a year-long campaign against shipping all mean that a strike on Iran now carries a risk-to-reward calculation that is fundamentally different from what it was in 2012, when Israeli planners were last seriously gaming it out. That changed calculus is not abstract. It is priced into every barrel of Brent crude trading above $90 today. Here's where this story stops being about missiles and starts being about your life. The immediate market reaction to escalation events in the Persian Gulf has followed a consistent pattern over the past 12 months. When Iran launched Operation True Promise in April 2024, Brent crude jumped $6 per barrel within 48 hours before partially recovering as the interception success reduced immediate supply disruption fears. When Israeli strikes on Iranian territory were confirmed in October 2024, oil moved $4 in the first trading session. The pattern is clear. Markets respond to signal, then partially correct when the immediate worst case does not materialize. But each correction leaves prices slightly higher than before the previous event. The baseline has been ratcheting upward. That is not volatility. That is a repricing of structural risk. The transmission mechanism from Gulf security risk to global energy prices runs through three choke points that collectively carry approximately 40% of the world's seaborne oil trade: the Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Suez Canal. The Strait of Hormuz alone carries approximately 21 million barrels per day. There is no realistic alternative routing for most of that volume. The Iraqi pipeline to Turkey carries approximately 450,000 barrels per day at maximum capacity, and the Saudi east-west pipeline to Yanbu on the Red Sea coast carries approximately 5 million barrels per day. Even if those pipelines ran at full capacity, which they do not, they would offset less than 30% of Hormuz flow. The rest has no alternative. If the strait closes, even partially, it does not slow the global economy, it stops it. The downstream industries affected by sustained oil price elevation read like a map of everything that moves in a modern economy. Aviation fuel, which is Jet A1 kerosene, is directly priced from crude oil benchmarks with a roughly 2 to 4 week lag. Airlines operating on thin margins, and the major U.S. carriers averaged a net margin of approximately 4% in 2023, begin hedging losses almost immediately when crude crosses $85. When crude sustains above $90, the hedges start to run out for carriers that did not lock in forward contracts, and ticket prices follow within 60 to 90 days. Petrochemical feedstocks, which include ethylene and propylene derived from naphtha, are the raw material for plastics, packaging, synthetic fibers, fertilizer precursors, and pharmaceutical coatings. When oil prices rise, these input costs rise, and they rise for every manufactured product that uses plastic packaging, which is nearly every manufactured product. The food connection is direct and measurable. Fertilizer production, specifically nitrogen-based fertilizers like urea and ammonium nitrate, is almost entirely dependent on natural gas as a feedstock. Natural gas prices are not directly set by oil prices, but they correlate. And in the European and Asian markets that import both, an oil price shock typically triggers a correlated gas price move within 3 to 6 weeks. When European natural gas prices spiked in 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, urea fertilizer prices rose from approximately $300 per metric ton to over $900 per metric ton at their peak. Agricultural input costs for the 2023 growing season in Europe and South Asia were the highest in recorded history. Farmers passed those costs to consumers. Consumers paid them at the grocery store. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from a missile fired over the Persian Gulf to the price of bread in your city. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed. This channel covers the full picture, the military event, the transmission mechanism, and the everyday price impact before it shows up in your utility bill. Now let us examine the countries most exposed to a sustained oil price elevation or supply disruption. Japan imports approximately 90% of its energy, with approximately 92% of its oil coming from the Middle East. Japan holds approximately 254 days of oil in its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, one of the largest reserve positions in the world, but that reserve is designed for full supply cutoff scenarios, not sustained high-price environments. For Japan, oil above $90 per barrel begins to widen the current account deficit meaningfully, puts downward pressure on the yen, and generates imported inflation in an economy that has only recently escaped decades of deflation. South Korea, which imports approximately 70% of its crude from the Middle East and holds approximately 106 days of strategic reserves, faces similar dynamics but with a manufacturing export sector, semiconductors, ships, automobiles, that is directly exposed to input cost escalation. India holds approximately 20 to 25 days of strategic petroleum reserves and imports approximately 87% of its oil. For India, every $10 increase in Brent crude adds approximately $12 to $15 billion to the annual import bill, widens the current account deficit, and puts depreciation pressure on the rupee. China, which has been building strategic reserves aggressively since 2022 and now holds an estimated 90 days of coverage, is in a stronger position. But China's economy is also growing more slowly than projected, and a sustained energy cost shock at this moment of structural stress is a risk Beijing is watching with acute attention. The timeline of economic pain from a sustained oil price move above $95 runs as follows. In weeks 1 through 4, the impact is primarily visible in futures markets, airline hedging costs, and shipping insurance premiums. In months 2 and 3, pump prices in major consuming nations adjust upward, freight rates on non-maritime routes begin to reflect higher fuel costs, and central banks in import-dependent economies begin to revise their inflation forecasts. In months 4 through 6, the consumer-facing price increases for food, goods, and travel become visible, and the political pressure in every democracy that imports oil intensifies sharply. That timeline matters because it means the pain you are already seeing at the pump is the beginning, not the peak. So who is talking to whom, and what are they actually trying to accomplish? The United States entered this moment with a set of diplomatic tools that have been degraded by years of inconsistent application. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020, normalized relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, but left the core Palestinian question unresolved. The Biden administration's attempt to broker a Saudi-Israeli normalization collapsed in October 2023 when the Hamas attack and the subsequent Israeli military operation in Gaza made public normalization politically impossible for Riyadh. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman told American interlocutors in private meetings through late 2023 and early 2024 that the kingdom could not be seen to be rewarding Israel during an active military campaign in Gaza that had produced mass civilian casualties. That was his public red line. His private incentive was different. He wanted a formal U.S. security guarantee, a mutual defense treaty equivalent, and he wanted American support for a civilian nuclear program that included domestic uranium enrichment capability. Washington could not deliver either without Senate ratification that was not politically available. Iran's position on the diplomatic chessboard is structurally interesting. Tehran does not actually want a full-scale war with Israel or the United States. What Iran wants is what it has been building toward for 20 years: recognition as the regional hegemon of the Persian Gulf, the removal of comprehensive economic sanctions, and the security guarantee that comes from being a threshold nuclear power, one that has the technical capability to produce a weapon but has chosen, for now, not to formally weaponize. What Iran needs to tell its domestic audience is that the resistance against American and Israeli pressure is succeeding, that the sacrifices of sanctions are producing results. The hardliners within the Revolutionary Guard have a different calculation. They benefit from the siege mentality that sanctions create, and they lose institutional power if Iran normalizes. That internal tension within the Iranian system is something every outside mediator has to navigate. The unexpected mediator in this moment is Oman. Muscat has served as the back channel between Washington and Tehran since at least 2012, when secret talks that eventually produced the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal were first conducted in Omani hotel rooms. Oman shares a maritime border with Iran across the Strait of Hormuz, has a historically non-aligned foreign policy, and has built genuine trust with both sides. In the months following the April 2024 direct strike exchanges, Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi made quiet trips to both Tehran and Washington. What was discussed has not been publicly disclosed. What can be inferred from subsequent behavior is that both sides communicated, at minimum, a shared interest in not allowing the next incident to trigger uncontrolled escalation. China's role is the one that analysts underestimated for years and are now recalibrating. Beijing brokered the Saudi-Iran rapprochement in March 2023, ending 7 years of severed diplomatic relations between Riyadh and Tehran. That was not a diplomatic coincidence. China imports approximately 9 million barrels of oil per day, making it the world's largest oil importer. China has no strategic interest in Gulf instability. What China does have is leverage over Iran through economic dependency, over Saudi Arabia through trade and investment relationships, and over the United States through the threat of complicating any multilateral response. China is not a mediator in the traditional sense. It is a stakeholder whose interests happen to align at this moment with de-escalation, and that alignment gives it a role that no Gulf War in the previous generation would have contemplated. Let us now examine the three scenarios that strategic analysts are actually working with. Not the public narratives, but the scenarios that shape contingency planning in defense ministries and energy trading desks. Scenario 1 is a negotiated resolution. What this requires, at minimum, is a ceasefire in Gaza that gives Iran's proxy network, particularly the Houthis, a public justification for standing down their maritime campaign. It requires a prisoner exchange or hostage deal that gives Hamas's political leadership a claim to have extracted some concession from Israel. And it requires a return to some form of nuclear dialogue between Iran and the P5+1 that gives Tehran a pathway back toward the economic normalization it needs. What each side gives up is significant. Israel gives up the narrative of total military victory in Gaza. Iran gives up the strategic momentum it has built through 18 months of proxy pressure. The United States gives up the clean diplomatic line that says it will not negotiate under fire. Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely in the near term given the domestic political constraints on every side? The evidence suggests it is difficult. The last serious negotiating session between American and Iranian officials, mediated through Omani channels, stalled in the spring of 2024 over Iran's insistence on guarantees that the next American administration would not unilaterally exit any agreement, a demand shaped directly by the memory of the Trump administration's 2018 withdrawal from the JCPOA. Scenario 2 is continued attrition. This is the scenario that currently has the highest probability among the analysts who model these outcomes formally. It assumes no decisive military action and no diplomatic breakthrough, but rather a sustained, low to medium intensity conflict environment in which Houthi interdiction of Red Sea shipping continues at its current pace. Iranian-backed groups conduct periodic strikes on American and Israeli-linked targets in Iraq and Syria, and the direct Iran-Israel exchange remains at the level of calibrated signals rather than mass casualty strikes. The economic cost of this scenario is not catastrophic in any single week, but it compounds. Every week of Red Sea disruption at current levels costs global shipping approximately $2 to $3 billion in additional transit costs and insurance premiums. The rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope is adding roughly 1 million tons of additional carbon emissions per month from the global shipping fleet, an environmental cost that translates into regulatory and reputational exposure for the companies involved. Oil prices in this scenario remain in the $85 to $100 range, which is high enough to squeeze consumer spending in import-dependent economies without triggering a recession, a sustained tax on growth rather than an acute shock. Scenario 3 is catastrophic escalation. This is the scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night, and the one that explains why oil markets are pricing in a risk premium that goes far beyond any individual incident. The trigger in this scenario is an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, specifically the enrichment infrastructure at Fordow, which is buried approximately 80 meters under a mountain and requires either the American-made GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator or a sustained multi-wave strike with specialized munitions to have a meaningful probability of destruction. If Israel conducts that strike, Iran's publicly committed response, stated by Supreme Leader Khamenei and corroborated by Revolutionary Guard commanders in multiple open-source statements, is a sustained missile and drone campaign targeting Israeli population centers, American military bases in the region, and Gulf energy infrastructure, Saudi Aramco's processing facilities at Abqaiq, which handle approximately 7% of the world's daily oil supply and were already struck once by Iranian-supplied weapons in September 2019, are on the target list, the East-West Pipeline, the Ras Tanura export terminal. Analyst models that game this scenario, and several energy security firms have published partial versions of them, produce Brent crude price estimates ranging from $140 to $200 per barrel within 72 hours of a confirmed Aramco infrastructure strike. That is not a projection designed to generate headlines. It is an arithmetic exercise. 21 million barrels per day through the Strait of Hormuz, disrupted or threatened simultaneously with 7% of global processing capacity, while markets price an extended conflict duration. The math produces very large numbers, so let us connect this back to you, not as an abstraction but as a direct line. Watch the price of diesel at your nearest truck stop. It is the fuel that moves every product on every highway in your country, and it prices within weeks of a crude oil move. Watch the price of your airline ticket if you are traveling in the next 90 days. Carriers are repricing forward inventory right now as their hedge books roll off at lower crude prices and new contracts are written at current levels. Watch the price of the cooking oil at your grocery store. Canola, sunflower, and palm oil are all linked to energy input costs through the fertilizer and transportation chain. Watch your heating bill if you live in a climate that uses heating oil or natural gas. Winter demand layered on top of an already elevated energy price environment is the scenario that European governments have been quietly preparing for since the summer. Watch the credit card processing fee disclosure the next time you pay for something at a gas station, because embedded in that transaction is the entire global supply chain that brought crude oil from a wellhead in the Persian Gulf to a pump in your neighborhood. The energy architecture that existed before October 7th, 2023 is not coming back. That is not alarmism. That is the assessment of the insurance actuaries who are pricing maritime risk in the Red Sea, the logisticians who are routing ships around Africa, and the defense planners who are watching the inventory of interceptor missiles across 3 different countries simultaneously. The world has entered a period of structural energy insecurity, not because any single actor chose it, but because the slow accumulation of decisions, miscalculations, and threshold crossings over 4 years has brought us to a moment where the stabilizing mechanisms that held oil prices in a predictable range are all under stress at the same time. And here is the genuine open question that no analyst, including the ones who have been most accurate about this trajectory, can answer with confidence. Does the current period of elevated tension produce a diplomatic opening, or does it produce the trigger event that crosses into scenario 3? The historical record of Middle East escalation cycles suggests that the most dangerous moments come not at the peak of public rhetoric, but in the quiet period that follows, when one side calculates that the other has been sufficiently deterred and tests that assumption with an action the other side cannot absorb without responding. We are in that quiet period right now. The next 60 to 90 days will tell us whether the Omani back channel, the Chinese economic leverage, and the American diplomatic pressure are sufficient to hold the line, or whether we look back at this moment as the point where the calculus changed. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.